Marcus Wellington never expected the woman in the simple gray sweatshirt to touch his $1 million prototype. "Fix it if you can," he sneered, certain she'd fail like his top engineers. But when Kate Williams rolled up her sleeves, she was about to prove that genius doesn't wear a suit. The morning started differently for Kate Williams. In her modest apartment across town, she sat at her small kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen displaying yet another job rejection email. The coffee had grown cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. Around her, the walls were lined with framed certificates and commendations that told a story most people would never hear. Her master's degree in aerospace engineering from the prestigious Maxwell Technical Institute hung beside her Navy aviation mechanics certification. Patents she'd co-authored were displayed next to letters of recommendation from military commanders who had trusted her with $1 million aircraft engines in combat zones. Kate had been unemployed for 3 years now, not for lack of skill or ambition, but because the aerospace industry had a very specific image of what an engineer should look like. She'd learned this lesson the hard way through dozens of interviews where her credentials were overshadowed by assumptions about her appearance. Her sister Sarah called every morning to check on her, offering encouragement and occasionally money that Kate was too proud to accept. "You're the smartest person I know," Sarah would say, their loss if they can't see it. This morning was different because Kate had finally secured an interview with Wellington Aerospace Industries, the company she'd admired from afar for years. Their innovations in hybrid turbine technology had revolutionized the industry, and their CEO, Marcus Wellington, was legendary for his engineering brilliance and business acumen. Kate had studied every patent they'd filed, every breakthrough they'd achieved, every technical paper they'd published. She knew their work better than most of their own employees. Standing in front of her closet, Kate made the same decision she'd made for every interview over the past 3 years. The expensive suits her sister had bought her hung untouched, tags still attached. Instead, she reached for the gray sweatshirt and worn jeans that had become her uniform of invisibility. She'd learned that when you look unremarkable, people's expectations are lower, and sometimes that gave you room to surprise them. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup beyond basic chapstick. If they were going to judge a book by its cover, she'd rather be underestimated than dismissed entirely. The bus ride to Wellington Aerospace gave Kate time to review her strategy. She'd researched every member of their engineering team, knew their backgrounds, their specialties, their recent projects. Dr. James Harrison had graduated from Maxwell Technical Institute 2 years ahead of her, though they'd never met. Kevin Anderson was a rising star, barely out of college but already making waves with his innovative approaches to fuel efficiency. Tom Brady was the old-school supervisor who'd worked his way up from the shop floor, earning respect through decades of hands-on experience. Kate respected all of them, even as she prepared to compete against the assumptions they would inevitably make about her. The gleaming floors of Wellington Aerospace Industries reflected the harsh fluorescent lights as Kate Williams stepped through the main entrance. Her worn sneakers squeaked softly against the polished concrete, a sound that seemed to announce her presence to everyone within earshot. She clutched a manila folder containing her resume, her knuckles white with nervous tension. At 34, Kate had learned to dress down for interviews, but the anxiety never got easier. Her gray sweatshirt was clean but unremarkable, her jeans practical rather than fashionable. She'd pulled her auburn hair back into a simple ponytail, avoiding any style that might draw unwanted attention. Experience had taught her that looking too polished often worked against her in male-dominated industries. The reception area buzzed with activity that spoke to the company's success and ambition. Men in expensive suits hurried past, talking into wireless headsets about quarterly projections and military contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Kate noticed how their eyes slid over her without recognition, dismissing her as someone who clearly didn't belong in their world of high-stakes engineering. She'd grown accustomed to this invisibility, though it never stopped stinging. These were her peers, people who shared her passion for innovation and precision, yet she might as well have been a janitor for all the professional recognition they afforded her. Ms. Williams, Helen Foster approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The executive assistant's tailored blazer and pearl earrings spoke of corporate sophistication and a salary that reflected her proximity to power. "Mr. Wellington is ready to see you." Her tone was polite but carried the subtle condescension of someone who had already formed opinions about Kate's suitability for the position. Kate had encountered this attitude countless times, the assumption that someone dressed as she was couldn't possibly have the credentials for a senior engineering position. They walked through corridors lined with awards and photographs that told the story of Wellington Aerospace's rise to prominence. Each image carefully documented their journey from a small repair shop to a global powerhouse in aerospace technology. Kate studied each photograph carefully, recognizing innovations that had revolutionized the industry and influenced her own work. She'd followed Wellington Aerospace's developments for years, admiring their breakthroughs in fuel efficiency and turbine design. Their patents had informed her own research during her time at the defense contractor, and their solutions had saved lives in the military aircraft she'd maintained under combat conditions. The technical specifications she'd memorized came flooding back as they passed displays of engine components and cutaway models. Kate could identify every system, understand every innovation, and appreciate the elegant solutions to complex engineering challenges. This wasn't just a job interview for her, it was a homecoming to the kind of cutting-edge work she'd dreamed of pursuing since her Navy days. But first, she had to convince Marcus Wellington that genius could come in a gray sweatshirt. The industrial workshop they entered took Kate's breath away, not just for its scale but for its potential. Massive overhead cranes moved engine components with surgical precision, while technicians in spotless coveralls assembled prototypes worth more than most people's houses. The air hummed with the sound of sophisticated machinery and carried the familiar scent of machine oil and metal shavings that had been the backdrop of Kate's military service. This was where innovation happened, where theoretical engineering became reality, where the future of flight was being written in steel and precision. Marcus Wellington stood at the center of it all, commanding attention even from across the vast workshop. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit custom-tailored to project the authority of someone who had built an empire through intelligence and determination. At 55, he transformed Wellington Aerospace from his father's small repair shop into a global powerhouse that competed with the industry's biggest names. His confidence showed in every gesture, every glance, every word. He was accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, and his entire demeanor reflected that expectation. "So, you're the mystery applicant," Marcus said, barely glancing up from his tablet as they approached. His tone carried the casual dismissal of someone who had already made his decision based on first impressions. "Your resume was interesting, though I have to say you're not quite what we typically expect for a senior engineering position." The words hung in the air like a challenge, designed to fluster and intimidate. Kate had heard variations of this comment in every interview, and she'd learned to let her work speak louder than her appearance. Kate straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly with the same steady confidence that had served her in military briefings with commanding officers. "I understand this is an unconventional interview, Mr. Wellington." Her voice was calm, professional, giving no indication of the storm of preparation and determination that lay beneath her composed surface. "Unconventional is putting it mildly," Marcus replied, gesturing around the workshop with theatrical flair. "This isn't exactly a place for double quotes," he paused, his eyes taking in her simple attire with the kind of assessment that reduced a person to their surface appearance. "Well, let's see what you're made of, shall we?" Behind Marcus, Dr. James Harrison and Kevin Anderson exchanged skeptical glances that spoke volumes about their expectations. Dr. Harrison, with his perfectly pressed lab coat and designer glasses, represented the academic elite of engineering, multiple degrees from prestigious institutions, published research, and the kind of theoretical knowledge that looked impressive on paper. Kevin Anderson, barely 25 but already earning a reputation as a rising star, embodied the new generation of engineers, tech-savvy, ambitious, and confident in their abilities. Both men had spent months struggling with a problem that had become Wellington Aerospace's biggest nightmare, and neither believed that the woman in the gray sweatshirt could offer anything they hadn't already considered. The real test was about to begin, and Kate could feel the weight of every assumption, every prejudice, every doubt settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. But she'd carried heavier loads before, and she'd learned that the best way to change minds was to exceed expectations so dramatically that skepticism transformed into respect. Marcus led Kate toward a workstation where the company's most expensive problems sat in gleaming, complicated silence. The prototype represented everything Wellington Aerospace aspired to be: innovative, precise, revolutionary. Its intricate maze of tubes, valves, and electronic sensors told the story of months of development and millions of dollars in research and development. Every component had been designed, tested, and refined by some of the brightest minds in aerospace engineering, yet something was fundamentally wrong. "This," Marcus announced with theatrical flair that barely concealed his frustration, "is our latest breakthrough in hybrid turbine technology." Or rather, it was supposed to be. His voice carried a note of bitter disappointment that suggested this wasn't the first time he discussed the problematic engine with potential solutions that had failed to materialize. The project had become personal for him, a test of his company's ability to innovate and compete at the highest levels of the industry. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his face grave with the weight of professional failure. "We've had our entire engineering team working on this around the clock for 3 months, he explained, his voice tight with the frustration of brilliant minds confronting an impossible puzzle. "The engine starts perfectly, runs flawlessly for exactly 43 minutes, then shuts down completely every single time. No exceptions, no variations, no clues." Kevin Anderson, his young face flushed with the embarrassment of repeated failure, added his own observations to the growing picture of their dilemma. "The shutdown sequence is perfect," he said, consulting his tablet filled with diagnostic data. "No warning indicators, no error codes, no signs of mechanical stress or system fatigue. It just stops, as if someone flipped a switch." The precision of the failure was almost more frustrating than a random breakdown would have been. Random failures could be attributed to manufacturing defects, material fatigue, or design flaws. But a failure that occurred with clockwork regularity suggested something more subtle, more elusive, something that had escaped the notice of some of the industry's most talented engineers. Marcus turned to Kate with a challenging smile that didn't hide his skepticism. "We've run every diagnostic procedure in the book," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone reciting a litany of expensive failures. "Thermal imaging, vibration analysis, computer simulations, stress testing, metallurgical analysis. Our best engineers, men with decades of experience and advanced degrees from the most prestigious universities in the country, are completely stumped." Kate approached the engine slowly, her eyes scanning the complex assembly with the methodical attention of someone who understood that first impressions could be deceiving. She could feel the weight of skeptical stares from the gathered technicians and engineers. Several had stopped their own work to watch what they clearly expected to be an embarrassing spectacle. Another outsider who would waste their time with amateur observations and obvious suggestions they'd already considered and dismissed. The engine was undeniably impressive, a masterpiece of modern engineering that represented the cutting edge of hybrid turbine technology. Kate could appreciate the innovation in its design, the elegant solutions to complex thermodynamic challenges, the precision required to manufacture components that operated under extreme conditions. But she also knew that the most sophisticated systems were often vulnerable to the simplest oversights. "The contract deadline is next Friday," Marcus continued, his voice growing sharper with the stress of impending failure. "The military is threatening to cancel the entire project if we can't deliver a working prototype. That's a $500 million contract hanging in the balance, not to mention our reputation and the jobs of everyone in this workshop." The stakes couldn't be higher. Wellington Aerospace had invested everything in this project: money, time, reputation, and the careers of their most talented people. Failure would mean more than financial loss. It would call into question their ability to compete at the highest levels of aerospace innovation. For Marcus, it was a test of the vision that had driven him to transform his father's small business into an industry leader. He picked up a wrench from the nearby tool cart and held it out to Kate with the kind of theatrical gesture that turned a job interview into a public challenge. "So, here's my proposition, Miss Williams. If you can figure out what my team of experts couldn't, the job is yours. Senior engineer, full benefits, starting salary of $150,000. Kate looked at the wrench, then at the engine, then at the faces surrounding her. Each person in the workshop represented years of experience, advanced education, and professional success. They were good at their jobs, dedicated to their craft, and genuinely puzzled by a problem that defied conventional analysis. But they were also trapped by their assumptions, their methods, and their certainty that they had already considered every possibility. "And if I can't?" Kate asked quietly, though she was already studying the engine's cooling system with growing interest. Her mind was beginning to process the information she'd gathered, sorting through possibilities and eliminating dead ends with the systematic approach she'd learned in the military. Marcus chuckled, the sound echoing off the high ceiling like a challenge thrown down. "Then I'll know my instincts about hiring practices are still sound." He glanced at his expensive watch with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been wrong about people. "You've got 2 hours. Think you can handle it?" The question hung in the air like a gauntlet, designed to intimidate and discourage. But Kate had faced more daunting challenges under far worse conditions. She'd diagnosed engine failures while under enemy fire, with lives depending on her ability to get aircraft back in the air. A corporate workshop, however skeptical its audience, was nothing compared to a combat zone where failure meant death. Kate reached for the wrench, her fingers closing around the cold metal with surprising confidence. 2 hours should be plenty, she said, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that made several people look up from their work. The workshop fell silent except for the distant hum of machinery, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Kate Williams had just accepted a challenge that had defeated some of the brightest minds in aerospace engineering. But she'd also accepted something more, the opportunity to prove that genius comes in many forms, and that the most important innovations often come from the most unexpected sources. As Kate began examining the engine more closely, the skeptical murmurs started almost immediately. The workshop's acoustics carried whispered comments that weren't quite meant to be inaudible, but weren't entirely private either. The technicians and engineers had formed their opinions the moment she walked through the door, and nothing in her initial examination was changing their minds. "Seriously," She thinks she can solve this. Kevin Anderson muttered to a colleague near the parts cabinet, his voice carrying the dismissive tone of youth convinced of its own superiority. My little sister could probably identify more engine components than this lady. The comment drew snickers from nearby workers who had spent months watching their best efforts fail against the mysterious engine problem. Dr. Harrison crossed his arms, watching Kate's every move with obvious disapproval and growing impatience. "Marcus, I have to question the wisdom of this exercise," he said, his voice pitched to carry across the workshop. "We're wasting valuable time that could be spent on actual solutions, not publicity stunts." His academic credentials and professional reputation were on the line, and he resented the implication that an outsider could succeed where he had failed. Kate knelt beside the engine, running her hands along the housing while carefully avoiding the surfaces that would still be hot from recent testing. Her movements were methodical, almost reverent, as she traced the path of cooling lines and electrical connections with the careful attention of someone who understood that every component served a purpose. To the observers, her approach seemed amateurish, too gentle, too cautious for someone who was supposed to be solving an impossible problem. "Is she afraid she's going to break it?" one technician called out, earning laughter from his coworkers who had grown cynical about the parade of consultants and experts who had failed to solve their problem. "Lady, it's already broken. You can't make it worse." Marcus leaned against a nearby workbench, clearly enjoying the show with the cruel amusement of someone who had never been proven wrong about first impressions. "Take your time, Ms. Williams. No pressure at all," he said, his sarcasm thick enough to cut with a knife. Though I should mention that Dr. Harrison here has 2 engineering degrees from Maxwell Technical Institute. Kevin graduated summa cum laude from State University's Mechanical Engineering program. "And Tom Brady over there," he gestured toward the gruff supervisor who had been watching from a distance, "has been working on engines since before you were probably even thinking about careers. 30 years of hands-on experience." The introduction was designed to intimidate, to emphasize the gulf between Kate's apparent qualifications and the expertise of the people who had already failed. But Kate ignored the commentary, focusing instead on a series of small sensors embedded in the engine's secondary cooling circuit. Something about their placement seemed off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what was bothering her. The sensors themselves were state-of-the-art, precisely calibrated, and positioned according to specifications that had been tested and validated through computer simulations. "Maybe she needs the instruction manual," Kevin suggested with mock helpfulness, his comment designed to draw more laughter from the growing audience. "I think we have a simplified version somewhere that uses smaller words and pictures." The workshop erupted in laughter that had an edge of cruelty, the kind of mockery that people use when they feel threatened by something they don't understand. Even Helen Foster, who had been maintaining professional neutrality throughout the interview process, allowed herself a small smile at the comment. The executive assistant had seen dozens of job candidates come and go, and she'd developed her own sense of who belonged in the high-stakes world of aerospace engineering. "You know what I think," Dr. Harrison said, his voice carrying across the workshop with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. "I think this is what happens when companies prioritize diversity over competence. Good intentions, sure, but engineering isn't about feelings or good intentions. It's about results, and results come from knowledge, experience, and proven ability." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, designed to put Kate in her place and remind everyone of the natural order of things. Dr. Harrison had worked too hard and achieved too much to watch his professional reputation be undermined by what he saw as a publicity stunt designed to make the company look progressive. Kate's jaw tightened, but she kept her focus on the engine with the discipline she'd learned in military service. She'd heard variations of these comments throughout her career, in classrooms where professors assumed she was in the wrong place, in workshops where mechanics tested her knowledge with questions they never asked male colleagues, in corporate offices where her ideas were dismissed until a man repeated them. She'd learned that the best response was always the same: let her work speak for itself. 43 minutes, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, her mind beginning to process the significance of that precise timing. Always exactly 43 minutes. The repetition of the failure was the key, she realized. Random failures were caused by random factors, but precise failures suggested systematic causes. Marcus checked his watch again with theatrical precision. 1 hour and 58 minutes remaining, Ms. Williams, he announced to the workshop. Though honestly, I'm not sure why we're dragging this out. We have real work to do and a deadline to meet. But Kate continued her methodical examination, seemingly oblivious to the increasingly harsh commentary swirling around her. She had developed an almost meditative focus during her years of military service, the ability to shut out distractions and concentrate on the problem at hand with laser-like intensity. Her fingers traced wire paths and tested connection points with the confidence of someone who truly understood what she was looking for, even if she couldn't yet articulate it. The skepticism in the workshop was growing more pronounced as time passed without any apparent breakthrough. The technicians and engineers had returned to their own work, but they continued to glance over at Kate with the kind of amused contempt reserved for obvious failures. They'd seen consultants and experts come and go, each one promising to solve the insolvable problem, and they'd learned to protect themselves from disappointment by assuming failure from the beginning. "Has anyone checked the thermal expansion rates?" Kate asked quietly, not looking up from her examination of the engine's core components. The question seemed almost timid in the hostile environment, but it came from a place of genuine curiosity rather than desperation. Dr. Harrison scoffed with the kind of professional disdain that comes from years of dealing with amateur suggestions. "Of course we have. That was literally the first thing we investigated 3 months ago. We're not amateurs, Miss Williams. We didn't just graduate from engineering school yesterday." Kate persisted with her questions, undeterred by the dismissive response. "What about the sensor calibration sequence?" she asked, now examining a cluster of temperature monitors near the engine's core with the methodical attention of someone following a logical progression of investigation. "All within normal parameters," Kevin answered impatiently, consulting his tablet for the 100th time that day. "Look, we've been through every possible variable. We've tested every component, analyzed every system, simulated every condition. The engine meets all specifications, passes every individual test, and runs perfectly until it doesn't," Kate finished, standing up and wiping her hands on a shop rag with the careful precision of someone who respected the tools of their trade. "The timing is too precise to be random. 43 minutes isn't arbitrary. It's a threshold." The observation was simple but profound, cutting through months of complex analysis to identify the fundamental characteristic of their problem. But the workshop's audience wasn't ready to accept that simplicity might hold the key to their sophisticated failure. Tom Brady shook his head dismissively, his weathered face showing the skepticism of someone who had seen every kind of mechanical failure over 3 decades of hands-on experience. "Lady, we've run thermal profiles, stress analyses, fluid dynamic simulations, vibration studies, and computer models that would make NASA jealous. If there was a threshold, we'd have found it months ago." Marcus was growing visibly impatient as the initial amusement of watching Kate fumble through the challenge wore thin, replaced by concern about the approaching deadline and the mounting pressure from military contractors who didn't care about internal company politics. Miss Williams, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but perhaps it's time to admit that this problem is beyond your capabilities. We have real work to do and real deadlines to meet. But Kate walked around to the opposite side of the engine, studying it from a different angle with the fresh perspective that sometimes revealed hidden truths. The cooling system routing seems inefficient, she observed, her voice still calm despite the growing hostility surrounding her. Why run the secondary lines through the lower manifold instead of the upper housing? The question seemed almost naive to the engineers who had lived with this design for months, but it came from a place of genuine curiosity rather than criticism. Kate wasn't questioning their competence, she was questioning their assumptions. Because that's how the specifications were written, Dr. Harrison replied curtly, his patience finally exhausted by what he saw as amateur critiques of professional engineering decisions. We don't question the design parameters that were developed by teams of specialists. We follow them, we implement them, and we make them work. Kate's next question cut to the heart of every engineer's worst nightmare. But what if the specifications are wrong? The workshop erupted in laughter that had an edge of hysteria, the kind of desperate amusement that comes from months of frustration and failure. Kevin nearly doubled over, slapping his knee with the exaggerated gesture of someone who couldn't believe what he just heard. Oh, that's rich. The specifications are wrong. Marcus, did you hear that? Our mystery applicant thinks the entire engineering team that designed this system made a fundamental error. The laughter was cruel and dismissive, but it also carried an undertone of fear. Every engineer's career was built on the assumption that expertise, education, and experience led to correct decisions. The possibility that they had all been wrong about something fundamental was too threatening to consider seriously. Those specifications, Dr. Harrison said with barely contained anger, his professional reputation feeling under attack, were developed by some of the most brilliant aerospace engineers in the country. They've been tested, retested, and validated through computer simulations and physical prototypes. They represent months of theoretical analysis and practical testing. Marcus pushed himself away from the workbench with the decisive motion of someone who had finally had enough. Ms. Williams, I think we've seen enough. This has been educational in its own way, but I have a business to run and a deadline to meet. Helen will show you out. But Kate didn't move from her position beside the engine, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Give me 5 more minutes, she said, the words carrying a weight that made Marcus pause despite his frustration. Please. Something in her tone made Marcus hesitate. Despite everything, the skepticism, the mockery, the apparent amateur mistakes, there was an unmistakable confidence in Kate's voice that suggested she had found something the others had missed. It was the kind of confidence that came from knowledge rather than hope, from certainty rather than desperation. Kate knelt down again, this time focusing intently on the area where the secondary cooling lines connected to the main housing. Her fingers moved with purpose now, testing fittings and examining joint connections with the keen eye of someone who had found exactly what she'd been looking for. The methodical examination was over. Now she was confirming a hypothesis that had been forming in her mind. The thermal expansion, she murmured, almost to herself, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had finally solved a puzzle that had been nagging at her subconscious. It's not the engine that's the problem, it's the sensor placement. She looked up at Dr. Harrison with sudden clarity, her eyes bright with the excitement of discovery. You said the engine runs for exactly 43 minutes every time, right? No variation whatsoever. That's correct, he replied grudgingly, though his tone suggested he wasn't interested in prolonging this exercise in futility. The precision of the failure had been one of their most frustrating clues, offering no variation that might point toward a solution. Kate continued her line of questioning with the systematic approach of someone following a logical chain of reasoning. And the ambient temperature in this workshop, what do you keep it at? Tom Brady answered automatically, his maintenance responsibilities including environmental controls. 72 degrees Fahrenheit, standard for precision work. We maintain that temperature year-round to ensure consistent testing conditions. Kate nodded, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in her mind with the satisfying precision of a well-designed mechanism. The sensors are measuring temperature differential, but they're not accounting for the gradual heat buildup in the surrounding housing material. After 43 minutes of operation, the metal expansion reaches a critical point where it creates a false reading. Kevin rolled his eyes with the exaggerated gesture of someone who had heard too many amateur theories over the past few months. That's ridiculous. The sensors are calibrated for thermal expansion. We're not rookies here. We understand basic thermodynamics. They're calibrated for the expansion of the components they're directly monitoring, Kate continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction as the solution became clearer in her mind. But not for the expansion of the mounting brackets that hold them in place. She pointed to a series of small metal brackets that secured the temperature sensors to the engine housing, components so basic that they had been overlooked in months of sophisticated analysis. These brackets are made of a different alloy than the housing itself. They expand at a different rate. After 43 minutes of operation, the differential expansion creates enough stress to pull the sensors slightly out of alignment. Marcus stepped closer, his skepticism warring with genuine curiosity as Kate's explanation began to make sense in a way that months of complex theories had not. Even if that were true, we're talking about tiny movements, fractions of millimeters. Fractions of millimeters are enough, Kate replied with the confidence of someone who had diagnosed similar problems under far more challenging conditions. The computer interprets the skewed readings as a critical system failure and initiates an automatic shutdown to prevent damage. The engine isn't broken, it's being overprotective. Dr. Harrison shook his head, his professional pride refusing to accept that such a basic oversight could have escaped the notice of experienced engineers. That's impossible. We would have caught something that elementary during initial testing. We're not incompetent. Kate's response was gentle but pointed, delivered without the condescension that might have accompanied such a revelation. Would you? Your initial tests were probably run in shorter intervals, before the thermal expansion reached critical levels. By the time you started running longer tests, you'd already committed to the current sensor configuration. The workshop had grown quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Several technicians had stopped their own work to listen more carefully to Kate's explanation, their skepticism beginning to give way to the possibility that she might actually be onto something. The theory was elegant in its simplicity, exactly the kind of oversight that could easily be missed by engineers focused on more complex potential failures. Marcus found himself actually considering her theory despite months of conditioning himself to expect failure from every proposed solution. It made sense in a way that all the sophisticated computer models and theoretical analyses had not. Sometimes the most complex problems had the simplest causes, hidden in plain sight where experience and expertise created blind spots rather than insight. "All right," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of challenge mixed with genuine curiosity that suggested he was finally taking Kate seriously. "Let's say you're right about the thermal expansion theory. How do you propose to fix it?" Kate was already reaching for a toolbox, her movements now confident and purposeful in a way that made several people take notice. "We need to relocate these 3 sensors to mounting points that use the same alloy as the primary housing. It's a simple modification that should take about 15 minutes. The simplicity of the proposed solution was almost insulting to engineers who had spent months pursuing complex theoretical explanations. But Kate's confidence was infectious, and her systematic approach to the problem had impressed even some of her harshest critics. Dr. Harrison crossed his arms, making one last attempt to maintain professional skepticism. Ms. Williams, those sensors are positioned precisely according to the original engineering specifications. Moving them could affect the entire calibration system and invalidate months of testing data. Only if we move them significantly, Kate replied, already loosening the first mounting bracket with practiced efficiency that spoke to years of hands-on experience. We're talking about a shift of maybe 2 inches, close enough to maintain accuracy, far enough to eliminate the expansion differential. Kevin watched skeptically as Kate worked, his youth making him particularly resistant to the idea that complex problems could have simple solutions. Even if you're right about the cause, you can't just start modifying a prototype without proper documentation and approval procedures. This isn't a shade tree mechanic operation. Marcus held up a hand, stopping the objection before it could derail Kate's work. Under normal circumstances, I'd agree, but we're past normal circumstances. He paused, studying Kate's confident movements with growing interest. How long did you say this would take? 15 minutes to relocate the sensors, Kate answered, not looking up from her work as she carefully disconnected the first temperature monitor. Then we run a test cycle. If I'm wrong, you're out 15 minutes and can put everything back exactly as it was. Marcus leaned forward, his businessman's instincts recognizing a low-risk, high-reward proposition. And if you're right. Kate finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly with the quiet confidence of someone who had solved impossible problems before. Then your engine will run continuously without the 43-minute shutdown, and you'll make your deadline with the military contract. The workshop was completely silent now, except for the soft sounds of Kate's tools and the distant hum of ventilation systems. Even the skeptics seemed mesmerized by her methodical approach to the modifications, and several technicians had gathered closer to observe her technique. Tom Brady moved closer to observe Kate's work, his 3 decades of experience allowing him to appreciate skill when he saw it. Despite his earlier dismissal, he had to admit that Kate handled the tools with the confidence and precision of someone who had spent considerable time working with delicate machinery under challenging conditions. Within 10 minutes, Kate had successfully relocated all 3 problematic sensors to new mounting points, her work proceeding with the smooth efficiency of someone following a well-planned procedure. She double-checked each connection, tested the security of the brackets, and verified that the sensor readings matched the expected baseline values with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details mattered. There, she said, stepping back from the engine and wiping her hands on a shop rag. The sensors are now mounted on brackets made from the same alloy as the housing. The thermal expansion should be uniform across all components. Marcus looked at his watch, noting that Kate had finished with time to spare. 45 minutes until the end of your 2-hour window. Think your theory is worth testing? Kate nodded confidently, her entire demeanor having transformed from the uncertain job applicant who had entered the workshop to the competent engineer she had always been. Start her up. Dr. Harrison moved to the control panel, his expression still skeptical but tinged with something that might have been hope. After months of failure, even the longest of long shots began to look attractive. Initiating startup sequence, he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet workshop. The engine came to life with a smooth, powerful hum that filled the workshop with the sound of precision engineering functioning exactly as designed. The startup sequence proceeded flawlessly, every system coming online in perfect synchronization, every parameter falling within normal operating ranges. The engine ran smoothly through the first 10 minutes, then 20, then 30, each passing minute building tension in the workshop as the critical 43-minute mark approached. As they neared the moment of truth, every person in the facility was watching the control panel displays with intense focus. The usual chatter had died completely, replaced by the steady hum of the engine and the collective holding of breath from everyone present. 42 minutes, Dr. Harrison announced, his voice tight with anticipation as he stared at the digital readout that had become the symbol of their failure for the past 3 months. 43 minutes, Kevin called out, his voice barely above a whisper as the moment of truth arrived. The workshop held its breath, waiting for the familiar shutdown that had haunted their work for so long. The engine continued running. 45 minutes, Tom Brady said, disbelief creeping into his voice as he realized that something fundamental had changed. The displays continued to show perfect operating parameters across every system. No warnings, no anomalies, no sign of the mysterious shutdown that had plagued them for months. 50 minutes, Helen Foster whispered, having joined the crowd around the control station. Her role as executive assistant had given her a front-row seat to months of failed attempts and growing desperation, making this moment feel surreal.